Truth is now becoming a kind of postmodern thing that you can accept or not accept. There are now apparently alternative facts. Well, I'm sorry, in my world, a fact is a fact. 2 + 2 = 4, you can't say, you can have an opinion that it equals 5, but if you think it equals 5, you're wrong. We cannot have a world where people think that the world is run by lizards, and somehow that's an equally valid view of reality than the reality that Charles Darwin told us about.
Hello, friends. Welcome to the podcast. Simon Gibson here. Podcast Success Won't Come Calling. If you are watching this on YouTube, do us a favour, just click subscribe for me, and then you will be informed as soon as possible whenever any of our episodes launch. You will make me a very happy man indeed. But in fact, I'm already happy because my guest this week, I'm delighted to say, is Angela Eagle MP. Angela, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm recovering from the loss of my voice last week, which obviously is pretty catastrophic for a politician.
Well, I bet it is. We were just talking off screen in terms of nowadays, we quite rightly are a little more cautious, aren't we, about when we wake up with a bit of a sniffle or a cough and we decide whether or not to step out in the real world. We review our options more carefully.
That's true with COVID, obviously, not least because you don't want to spread germs around, but then everyone thinks that you've got the plague, and so it's not a good thing. So for responsible reasons, I took a couple of days off last week.
Well, very well earned, I'm sure.
Wouldn't have happened normally. I mean, in the past, it really in Parliament depends on how close the parties are. If you've not got a majority government, then it's a lot harder to take a day or two off if there's votes.
And these days, can't you vote by proxy? There was all this business, wasn't there, during COVID where everyone was on Zoom and that sort of thing?
Well, you mean Mr. Cox voting by proxy from
we'll come to him.
Caribbean. They did make particular arrangements because of COVID, but unfortunately they've completely taken them all away again. So you now have to vote in person or not at all.
Right. Well, you're very used to this because next year marks your 30-year anniversary as a member of Parliament.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of protocol on this? Is there a cake, or does Keir Starmer give you the birthday bumps or anything like that?
It's only what you organise. I think in Parliament a lot of people organise themselves by intake, but there's not many of my intake left. I mean, I was the youngest of my intake in 1992, age 31. And so most of the people that I came in with have departed, retired, and gone. So it wouldn't be a very big party.
Well, I mean, do you ever find a moment to reflect on that period of time? Because 30 years to do anything is quite remarkable. But to be a member of Parliament where not only have you seen so many comings and goings and change, but also you've got the fact that your constituents through generations now have stuck with you and supported you and wanted you to represent them. Have you ever took a moment to reflect on that achievement?
Well, I'm too busy doing the job to be too reflective about it, but I am always enormously grateful to my constituents through time for giving me the chances and the honour of representing them. And when I'm out door knocking and I'm talking to people, quite often we have conversations about this, or I come across people who I've helped in the past. One story I can think of immediately, a few general elections ago, I was out door knocking and I knocked at a door over in Morton, and the woman came to the door and she said, "Oh, Angela, you got me this house." She called her daughters over and she said, "This woman saved my life." She said, "Because I was in such a state, you saved my life. I wouldn't have had the kids if it wasn't for you." And there's no job satisfaction like that, really.
Not many people will hear someone once say that. What actually motivated you to become or to stand for Parliament?
Well, I was always very opinionated. My sister, I'm a twin, and she's also a member of Parliament. We were very motivated by the way that society was and what it had done to our parents and our grandparents. My mum was very clever but failed the 11 plus and was told she had to work in a biscuit factory. My dad didn't pass the 11 plus and can still remember the questions he didn't know the answers to. He's 85 now. And my grandparents, very working class people in Sheffield, just never had a chance to fulfill any of their potential. And the unfairnesses and how my family were treated were part of our story growing up. And I just thought it was extremely unfair that we should have a society that would write off so many people just because of where they came from or what their class position was right at the beginning of their lives. And so I always had this view that we should have a much fairer society. And I think that was about what we talked about growing up. Our parents both said to Maria, my twin, and I that you mustn't lose any of the opportunities or make the mistakes we made. You must get educated. And we were the first in our family ever to go to university as a result of that. And it was Oxford for both of us. And I wanted to make sure that I contributed to making society better and use the privileges that I'd had to give back.
And we sit here in 2021. Do we have a fairer society than the one you entered Parliament in?
In many ways, we do. And in lots of other ways, we don't. For example, I think it's a fairer society for women than it was. If you only look at the fact that I wasn't allowed to play cricket when I was growing up because I was a girl and I wasn't allowed to play with the boys, and there were very few girls' teams that you could get hold of. That when I played chess and when I won the girls under-18 British Championship, my prize money was £12.50, and the under-11 boy took home £40. So I was always aware of these unfairnesses that there were around, lack of opportunities for women. Those sorts of things have improved in many ways, but lots of things haven't. And obviously poverty and child poverty is a huge issue. I never thought I'd be in a situation going into 2020s where we've got food banks and people aren't being able to feed their kids properly or heat their homes. So there's a lot still to do because progress can go backwards as well as forwards.
It's a strange one, isn't it, that this issue of food banks and the other economic pressures you mentioned, because my understanding is that globally we've been able to reduce the number of people living in poverty very significantly.
Yeah.
Yet it does seem that in our own country, I mean, I'm not sure I ever recall things like food banks even 6-7 years ago. What's happened there? Why do we seem to be moving perhaps backwards when other parts of the world seem to be moving forwards?
It's about distribution of the income that we're making. And so what we've seen, especially since 2010, when I'm going to be party political here, when the Labour Party lost office, we had the austerity years, huge public sector cuts and huge cuts in benefits for people who can't work. And we've also had deregulation in the labour market. So even if you do work, 40% of those who are on universal credit are actually in work because real wages have gone down or people's work is fragmented and they can't make enough to live on. And so there are those things that are causing the poverty. Cuts in public services, cuts in the level of benefits and deregulation in the labour market. If you could deal with those three things, then you wouldn't see the kind of in-work poverty that we've got, and then you could concentrate on the out-of-work poverty.
So were you really encouraged when you heard Boris say at the party conference, the Conservative Party conference, that we're heading towards a future of high skill and high salaries and low tax? Did you believe him? Were you applauding?
I don't ever believe him. And I think the more we see his record in office, the more we know that he says whatever he thinks will get him what he wants and then fails to deliver on any of it. So absolutely nothing wrong with having an aspiration to have a high wage economy, But to do that, you need to increase productivity. You need education and skills training. We don't have a system that's fit for purpose. We don't have a government that believes you can plan for that. They want the market to just deliver it, and patently it never has. And so we are going nowhere with that. In fact, we've got the highest level of taxes from next April than we'll have seen since the 1950s. And we've also got stagnating real wages. There's an incredible statistic I was discovered in some of my work on the recent budget. From 1992 to 2008, real wages, that is what you can actually buy with your money, taking account inflation and costs, went up by 36% in those 16 years. In the 16 years from 2008 to 2024, so 2 years from now, 3 years, it's expected to have gone up by plus 2.4%. So what we've seen is a complete stagnation of real wages and what people can buy with it. Much bigger pressure on people at work, expected to do more for less, costs going up. And that's without the inflation levels that we've got now, which are touching 5%, 6% if you take rent into account.
So we need to see some more evidence that we're heading in this trajectory.
Well, it's a fine trajectory to aim for,
yes.
But you can't just say that's your aspiration and then do nothing to bring it about.
And then stop talking, which is what he did. One of the performances or contributions in Parliament that you gave, which really sticks with me, was a couple of years ago when, I don't know if everyone who's watching and listening will recall, but there was some protests in Birmingham by parents who were objecting, I think on religious grounds, to various parts of the school curriculum, including issues around LGBTQ. And you gave a wonderful speech in the Commons. And what stuck with me about it was two things. First of all, you were able to put across how passionate and certain you were in your position. That came across in spades. But you also were able to remain compelling, rational, and persuasive. I wondered whether that's your view of how politics should be, that people should be prepared to be passionate and to be clear and to be confident, but that we shouldn't give up on the fact that we are at our most successful when we're persuading others that our opinion is right.
Well, clearly, if you want change, you have to be persuasive. If you're trying to get from a position where LGBT people, for example, were not even legally allowed to exist, to one where we now have got, at least in theory, legal equality and civil partnerships and equal marriage and all of those things. You have to persuade people who don't agree with your position. The thing about that particular speech was that these protests outside schools are all built on lies about what is actually in the curriculum, which is pushing bigotry and making claims that are untrue about what is being taught, which is basically that you should just accept that some people are gay and you should respect them as individuals and not be bigoted and not discriminate against them. That's all that is. And it's to avoid the huge and tragic legacy of Section 28, which saw many LGBT people bullied to the edge of their own existence at school and teachers unable to help support them. So this issue is about teaching people inclusively about sex education and the realities of relationships. That's all it is. And so to have that kind of bigotry resurface, to see that it's being deliberately organised in a way that exploits the fears of parents with untruths, if you don't call it out, if you don't stop it, what happens is LGBT rights go backwards. And we're seeing that a bit at the moment with the attacks on trans people.
Absolutely.
That's a gateway drug, by the way, to wider homophobia.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I think that when you made the point that there are still issues that need to be tackled in this area of inclusivity on the basis of sexuality, which is clearly correct. when my kids are 7 and 10, and when they come home from school, particularly my eldest Amelia, she clearly has a far greater understanding and is able to articulate her inclusive beliefs in such a way that I think that rational discourse like that which you put across in the Commons that day, I think that's allowed things to progress positively, at least in terms of what our children are taught and the way they're taught.
Well, I think that the fact that there are out politicians, I think we're meant to have the gayest parliament in the world now, apparently. Doesn't feel that way all the time. But when people are out and people can see that they're just as ordinary as everybody else and they're not the other that can be problematized or discriminated against or treated in a bad way, that helps society move on and be more accepting of people in all their variety. And I think that creates a healthier place for people to grow up and be themselves.
Yes, I think you're right. You mentioned the issue of prejudice that trans people are facing. I perceived, and perhaps I'm wrong, that there was perhaps a bit of disunity in the Labour Party around this really important issue, insofar as in the lead up to the conference this year, 2021, there was something of a social media scandal in terms of one MP, Rosie Duffield, made a tweet which was perceived to be transphobic. Some members of the party came out with an element of defence for Rosie. Keir Starmer came out and effectively corrected her. She didn't attend the party conference due to concerns that she had. Did you, as a rationalist who took part in this compelling discussion, persuasive discussion, on issues which you feel very strongly about, did you feel a little disappointed that there wasn't more of that in this debate?
Well, I think that if debates begin on Twitter, that is not the place to have any kind of coherent, sensible discussion. More often than not, it's a sewer. And a lot of the things that appear on it are deliberately provocative and done from places that you can't prove. They're not done transparently. And I think quite a lot of them are deliberately done to cause fights between, say, feminists and LGBT activists who are actually fighting for the same thing, which is to have a society that's freer, where people can express themselves.
Yes.
And so if the forces of darkness that want to keep people, women, back in the kitchen or have gay people back in the closet, can get those two liberation movements to fight each other, it's much less likely that there'll be progress. So I'm one of those people that says equality and the issues around equality, be it for people with disabilities or BAME people, are all best progressed by us working together. So I'm not in favour of people fighting over ridiculous myths about bathrooms.
No.
And people should see the bigger picture and realise that this is people provoking forces of liberation to try to get them to fight each other rather than make progress in society. And I think we should see all human beings for what they are, as human beings with feelings and needs. And we shouldn't be saying people shouldn't exist or that somehow they're illegitimate or a danger. There are so many of the tropes that I'm hearing in and around the trans debate that remind me of what I heard in the 1980s growing up, said about gay people, which is that you can't trust them around children and don't be anywhere near them in a bathroom. And it's just insulting. And we just need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture of how we make progress in society. And that's by working together to stop people being oppressed for what they are rather than who they are.
I agree. Where I am on this debate, I always stand firm on my belief that people should be able to behave and say and dress and express themselves in a manner which, as long as it operates within the law, They should be allowed to.
And I mean, if there's a male to female transgender person in a bathroom when I'm in a bathroom, it's not a problem. Nor is it a problem if there's a female to male transgender person in the gents' toilets, unless you decide to make a big thing of it. I'm a live and let live sort of person, really.
Me too. Just playing devil's advocate, I suppose. There are obviously people who think differently, and for their own reasons, they will feel that the issue is more complex than that there are more nuances in the argument that we need to talk about. The concern that I've got when I see skirmishes and scandals around these very important areas, that people who are sort of in the middle of the debate, that they perhaps want to learn more about what the issues are, that they want to understand and empathise with people in those circumstances. I'm worried that there is so much noise coming from all sides of the argument that perhaps there aren't enough Angela Eagles in the middle sort of doing this rational persuasion and highlighting of issues. Do you share that concern?
Well, I think that there are certain provocateurs on all sides that are pushing agendas that I would say were quite reactionary. I don't believe in biological essentialism because that traps women in the kitchen.
Yeah, true.
So, I think you have to say that, women aren't biologically disposed to be more caring than men. It may be that society has evolved in a way which rewards men for showing their anger rather than their care and rewards women the other way. That doesn't mean that's biologically a thing. And so I think that this whole area of debate is about allowing people to be themselves rather than have to run down what's expected of being a man. I think that's as oppressive for some men as it is for women who are expected to be a particular way. And I just think we should. The fact is that in the last few years, trans people have become more visible. It's not an area that lots of people are familiar with, and so when that becomes a visible thing, as with any kind of change, there's a panic. And you can only deal with that by being reassuring and having debates and trying to put people in touch with each other so they can talk and try to understand something that they haven't come across maybe before personally. And that's what I tried to do.
Well, and you succeeded in that. Just to sort of move this discussion on sort of the same topic, there was what seemed to me to dovetail into this slight scandal around the party conference, which arguably overshadowed it a little, was the...
I think the press release was meant to overshadow it, but I don't think
right, fair enough. There was then, I'm sure you're aware, there was a university professor called Kathleen Stock, who is herself, as I understand it, a member of the LGBTQ community. She published a book which included, amongst many other things, comment around trans issues. And she received quite a backlash from not all of her students, I'm sure, but many students, a sort of an indifferent response at times from her university, from which she's since resigned. There was also comment upon that within the Labour Party in terms of there was some support of her position. I think there was also some quite strong criticism of her. Was this something you were aware of at the time this played out as a news agenda?
Well, obviously, I watch the news all the time, and I know what certain people's agendas are, and that is to have these culture wars about these kinds of issues to, I think, take away people's attention from what's actually going on in the country, which is that this government isn't delivering HS2 or any of its promises. It's taken away the pensioners' triple lock, which was in its manifesto. It said it wouldn't increase VAT, national insurance or income tax, and it's put income tax and national insurance up. We're just waiting to see what happens with VAT. And so I just think it's very convenient to have all of these cultural issues going on, taking away the news agenda from what I think are more important things. I think that having been on the receiving end of social media outrage when I stood against Jeremy, it can seem a very, very difficult place to be when you're on the receiving end of stuff like that, but it isn't always as real as people think it is. And I think a lot of people, when subjected to that, with out-of-control social media and provocateurs as well, think that it's a lot more prevalent in reality than it is. Now, I don't think as a society we've got in control of how our discourse is happening at the moment with social media and the Wild West that is out there. And we're in a situation, we've now had 2 MPs assassinated because of populist outrage and for various different reasons, but from political extremism and anger, which is stoked in some of these areas. We're seeing things like the incel movement, which happened down south the other day, a loss of life there because of the way that people are groomed. Men are groomed to regard women as a problem because they don't get sex from them. And I think that we're in a different environment that we haven't learned to evaluate properly or, in fact, control and regulate properly yet. That will change over time, but I think at the moment, be it Kathleen Stock or anyone else who's subjected to these things, it can be very frightening and difficult. And I think that we've all got to take a step back and think about what we're doing and the impression that we're giving people.
I completely agree that as a form of discourse, the 264 characters you get on Twitter, I think it's about that. Even just looking at that, it is a hopeless method of communicating any form of message which carries any form of nuance. It's simply impossible.
Yep.
If you also...
But then you have to take account of the fact that because on social media at the moment, people don't have to identify themselves. You don't know. We do know from various things going on that foreign actors, states, all sorts of other organizations can masquerade on social media as if they're people. We know what happened with the American election and Trump and what the Russians did in terms of making it look like there were real people tweeting this sort of stuff. I think we've just got to be a lot more savvy about questioning what we see as presented as real on social media, because a lot of the time it just isn't.
Well, that's right in a number of respects. I mean, there's actually, in the public domain now, there's an argument on Reddit, that's one of the other social media platforms, which is being partaken entirely by fake profiles.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that until such time as everyone is accountable for what they say on social media in the same way as we are when we walk along the street, it seems to me that to try and tackle this problem becomes very difficult, because how can you influence people's behaviours if you don't know who they are?
Well, that's, or whether they exist, or whether you're being played.
Correct.
And that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is the Wild West that is social media at the moment will have to be tamed, because it threatens the existence of democracy itself. And we've seen that in America. We've seen it with some of the grooming, as I say, of incels. That behaviour, which might seem fun in a closed Reddit conversation, is now bleeding over into real behaviour in our communities, and people have lost their lives down south because of that particular rampage. Also in Canada, because of incel rampages. It's not funny anymore. I mean, if you actually look at what happened with the in Burma, that was facilitated on social media. And so I think that the social media companies have got to be called to account much more for the consequences of the algorithms that they use, which maximize their advertising revenue by drawing attention to hate and controversy. Now, when they're doing that, they see they get more reactions for hate and controversy. It ratchets up. And then we start getting people assassinated and killed as a result. Now, I'm not saying it's all social media, but they have to take their share of responsibility for what's begun to happen.
It's a very difficult problem to tackle, though, in my view, because I agree with everything you've said. But I don't know if you've ever seen the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. It's by a guy called Tristan Harris, who was head of ethics at Google, I think. And he actually was quite...
Or was that a part-time job?
No, he talks about it, that it's a job he almost made for himself. So he did well there. But he actually goes into some detail on the point that you raised, that what the social media algorithms are driven towards is the fact that human attention is captured more by the negative and the catastrophic and the traumatic than it is, say, the positive and the optimistic. And to actually get to grips with that, it requires such a level of policing and regulation that I'm just not sure.
Change the business model. You don't need to do that. You don't need to police it in that way. I mean, if you made them liable in the way a publisher would be liable, they'd find a way to deal with it, I can tell you. But the second thing is, it's the business model. The business model is, we will give you all this stuff free, but we will collect all the data there is about you and where you browse and what you do and what you're interested in and what colour bras you buy.
Yeah, absolutely. Know everything
and then
about
we'll
us.
flog it to anyone who gives us any money, so they can then try to get you to behave in particular ways, and they know everything about you. Now, there are different methods and models of having social media. For example, subscription services where you pay and there isn't advertising.
Like Netflix. Yeah.
Services where you own your data. And so there are different ways these services could be provided, but it wouldn't create the gazillion billionaires that run Google and Facebook at the moment. So, they're not so interested in migrating the business model to something that's more socially acceptable and acceptable generally. I am.
Well, that is... it's very laudable, but I just query if it's realistic. Let me just put a devil's advocate point to you. You made two really interesting points there. The first one is holding them to account in the same way a publisher would be held to account. Now, the problem there, as I see it, is they're not publishing anything. Isn't it arguable that they're like a techno town square where they're providing the platform through people to speak, but they are not the owners of the content, they're not recommending the content, they're not directly making any profits from the content. So how could you hold them to account in the same way as you would, say, a newspaper owner who authorises a particular story to be published?
Well, I think that there are many ways that you could start curbing the bad social effects that are now emerging. And I have to say, the challenge to democracy.
Yes.
To our very freedoms, which is emerging from the way that social media works. And it's clear if you look at the way that social media works in China and the way it works in the West, that there are different ways of evolving social media. In China, there's mass censorship. Tennis just recently disappeared because that tennis star who used social media to accuse a very high-up Chinese official of sexual assault.
Yes.
She's now disappeared, and you couldn't actually search tennis at all in the whole of social media in China in the last couple of days. So it's quite clear that this stuff can be much more directed than the libertarians in the West would have us believe. And as always, I'm a social democrat. I think that you can find a happy medium somewhere between mass censorship and the control of the Chinese Communist Party and the Wild West.
Well, there has to be, doesn't it? There has to be a happy medium. Where I've always just, I don't have an answer for this at all, but it's about how you use regulation to achieve that happy medium, or whether you have to let the market to some extent regulate itself. Because, of course, you did hit the nail on the head in terms of Facebook and all of the social media platforms have arrived at this business model, which is very appealing to many of their members.
Mark Zuckerberg loves it, but he would, wouldn't he?
Yeah, but isn't the genie out the bottle now? I mean, how can we persuade private companies that their business model is unethical?
No, the genie is never out of the bottle. If it's out of the bottle, it can be controlled. If you look at what happened in the first industrial revolution, when you had monopolistic control of a lot of stuff, railways, industry, in America, those big monopolistic companies were broken up. You could break the tech companies up. You could mandate them to behave in certain ways. States can do that. And they can particularly do that if they come to agreements cross nationalities to do it in big markets. So, no, never let anyone say to you that somehow nothing can be done about a social media that is now creating a lot of very bad ill effects and threatens our democracy itself.
It does. It really does. Some of the outcomes that's being achieved, because you are right about sort of foreign actors, different countries.
And truth.
Yes.
I mean, truth is now becoming a kind of a sort of postmodern thing that you can accept or not accept. There are now apparently alternative facts. Well, I'm sorry, in my world, a fact is a fact. 2 + 2 = 4. You can't say, you can have an opinion that it equals 5. But if you think it equals 5, you're wrong. And so we have to have a structure whereby that kind of Enlightenment view of facts and the scientific method and all of that is actually accepted as truth. We cannot have a world where people think that the world is run by lizards. And somehow that's an equally valid view of reality than, the reality that Charles Darwin told us about. Now, we are perilously close to that now. And no democracy can survive if truth becomes something that you can accept or develop a different view of.
No, I had to smile about the comment about lizards. I mean, this.
You know who I'm talking about.
I do indeed. I do. There are quite a number of these rumours going around. But whenever I have a conversation with someone who goes down this road and you challenge them on things like, people might get things wrong. Governments might make mistakes. They might have dreadful policies, but they're not got lizards sat somewhere behind them. But I have had that serious conversation with a number of people.
That's how difficult it is.
Yeah. Now, this government are in a bit of a pickle, aren't they? Just so I'm conscious that everyone will be watching this at different times and that sort of thing. 2021, November, last month, there was a real debacle in Parliament in that an MP who has since resigned called Owen Patterson, he was found by the Standards Committee in Parliament to have breached regulations in terms of advocacy and lobbying. He was working on behalf of...
Paid advocacy.
Quite.
We're all advocates. We're just not meant to take money for doing it.
Indeed. And he was... the view that was formed by the committee was that he should be suspended for 30 days, which to those of us who aren't in Parliament, you look at that and you think, well, if I was at work and I got found that I was somehow acting improperly for financial means, I probably wouldn't be suspended for 30 days. But leaving that to...
Well, having said that, just very briefly before you ask your question, that level of suspension would have allowed a recall petition to be to be set up in his constituency, and then that would have had it passed, given his constituents the chance to decide whether they wanted him still to be their MP. So
the devil's in the detail.
The nature of that was that it breached the demand for recall.
That's really helpful. I understand that now. So what happened then in Parliament was that the government, in fact, I think it was a backbench MP, proposed that there be a suspension of the process, there be a stalling of the process, whilst effectively the rules could be reconsidered. And the point that was made by the government and the Conservative MPs was that the right of appeal should be implemented. They decided effectively they wanted to consider rewriting the rule book and reversing the decision of an independent committee. How were you feeling when all of this was playing out in front of your eyes?
It was the most disgraceful episode that I've sat through, and I've sat through a few. probably since I got into Parliament. And I've lived through the cash for questions issues that happened in the 1990s. That was 2 Tory MPs who were putting questions down to order for £10,000 apiece in brown envelopes. So we changed the rules to make it explicitly the case that that couldn't be. But, you know, the rule on paid advocacy, that is asking people for money in exchange for advocating for their particular interests to the government, which is what Owen Patterson was found guilty of doing. That has been illegal since 1697, but very, very, very explicitly illegal since the cash for questions issues right at the beginning of my parliamentary career. It's been obvious and everybody knows that you cannot do that. And yet Owen Patterson denied that he had done it, said he'd do it again. I mean, this man was getting £100,000 a year from this particular company. To the tune of about £500,000 in payments. Now, he was offered the chance to pay it back, didn't, just, and it wasn't a backbench MP, actually. It was, but what was really going on was that the Chief Whip and the Leader of the House, they've openly said as much now, connived between themselves to create this motion which would have set aside Owen Patterson's punishment and set up a new committee with a Tory majority on it and a Tory chair to look at the whole system again. Their argument that Owen Patterson hadn't had an appeal is a lie. The commissioner, who is independent, does the investigation. The committee, which is of members of Parliament but also has lay people on it, took the appeal and dismissed it. So there was an appeal. And so the issues were very, very open and shut. And no report from this particular Standards Committee or any of its predecessors has ever not been accepted in Parliament, ever. So it was an astonishingly disgraceful episode. And I'm not surprised that it was overturned. I was very, very, very upset that night when it had gone through by 18, but it was so close, I didn't think that it would last.
And what seemed significant to me was that for the first time I can remember with this government, such a significant number of their own MPs, whilst not many voted against them.
13 of them were in our
That's right.
lobby, and I shook all their hands.
But a much bigger number didn't abstained or were absent, and that seems to me to be significant. I want to come back to that when I want to ask you about Labour's opportunity to get back into government, and I'd want to come back to that if I can. When I heard some of the ministers coming out after this scandal had unplayed and were referring to it in such terms as it's a storm in a teacup, people aren't that interested, I think they've got that wrong, you know, because I think people do care about how those they elect to represent them in Parliament behave, because at the end of the day, even if the administration or the governance around politics isn't something that we deal with every day, how can you trust someone on the economy or health or education if they've got ulterior motives? So I think they've got that wrong. Yeah,
they have. And I think they realised they got it wrong as well. But it didn't stop them misbehaving the way that they did in the most astonishing way with that proposal and actually forcing people to vote on it, house business, which is what that was. It's not the government, it's house business, isn't usually whipped.
Right.
They put a 3-line whip on it. So that was an affront as well. So I don't think they got anything right about that. And it's got to be the case that, I've got businesses in my constituency that I go and see ministers about stuff that they're interested in or contracts or whatever. I don't send them a bill for doing it.
Well, you're representing your constituents, aren't you?
That's right. And obviously, if local businesses do well, then my constituents get more job opportunities. That's just part of the job.
Quite.
When I came out of government, I'd been in the Treasury, I'd been pensions minister. There are many companies I could have phoned up like Owen Patterson did and asked if they had anything on the books. I have never taken any money for doing second jobs. And it would never occur to me to do so. I don't have that sense of entitlement. 90 Tory MPs at the last count do.
Well, it does seem to be on one side of the house, doesn't it?
It is.
But
overwhelmingly on one side of the house.
It has the debate arising from that Owen Patterson affair is sort of has grown a life of its own around this issue of second jobs.
Yeah.
Because, of course, as I understand it, there's nothing preventing, for example, Keir Starmer, I think he's still a practicing barrister.
I think he's given up his practice
has he?
certificate since he became leader of the party.
Because I heard Dominic Raab on Breakfast TV a couple of mornings ago really engaging in like a real tit-for-tat type discussion. He was saying, we need to know who Keir Starmer has advised. And, of course, his colleague, Geoffrey Cox, who he's very much in the firing line at the moment around his own
Well, I mean,
work
he
as a
was
barrister.
advising the British Virgin Islands, who HMRC, our tax authorities, are trying to take to court for doing various things which are getting out of money things and reducing the tax take for HMRC and UK tax authorities. So actually, as the ex-Attorney General, he is hawking himself round to try to help tax havens minimise their duties to ensure that tax is paid to HMRC. So I think that's a bit different to giving any other sort of advice.
How is he justifying it to himself there, ethically,
well,
do you
you'll
think?
have to ask him.
Yeah, I'd love to have him on.
I think that...
I couldn't afford him.
No, you couldn't. Neither could I.
We talk about succeeding...
But the thing
Sorry,
is,
go on.
I just want to say, Dominic Raab and both the Prime Minister as well, talking about Keir Starmer, they are trying to say that both sides are the same and we're all the same, and that we're all as motivated by money and second jobs and all of that and that kind of cash as they are. But the fact is there's 5 Labour MPs that take extra jobs, one of whom is a doctor and has been working extra shifts in A&E during the COVID epidemic.
Yeah.
There's 90 of them that are doing it, often for very large amounts of money. We are not all the same. We do not have the same view of outside earnings. And it's party policy at the moment that there should be no second jobs for members of Parliament, except for public service jobs. Like there are some military reservists. Yeah. There are people who are doctors who sometimes do shifts and things like that. You could see that there's a point in doing that, but not hawking yourself around giving advice for, $500,000.
I think that people will have an issue with that, which brings us, I suppose, quite nicely onto the prospects of the next election, because we're basically not far off mid-Parliament now, and it's not that long when there will be another a general election. If there were an election tomorrow, bearing in mind this disarray that it sounds like this government might well be in, would you feel Labour would be well placed to win that election?
Well, we've got a Everest to climb in terms of, I think we need a 12% swing to get a majority. That wasn't done in 1945 or 1966 or 1997, which are our big 3 landslide wins in history. But I think our politics is very volatile at the moment. And there's a lot that's in flux, and I'm the eternal optimist. So I don't think that it does any harm to say that this is possible, but it'll take an enormous effort, and we'll also have to be very persuasive and get a proper hearing of voters. But I detect in the last few weeks the Prime Minister has... They're beginning to get the measure of him now, that this is a man who'll say anything, say whatever he thinks people want to hear, and then not deliver it if he thinks it'll get him on at the time.
Talking of that, What was your
I might
reaction?
even say liar, but, obviously you can't say that on the floor of the House of Commons. Fortunately, we're not on the floor of the House of Commons.
I can't claim any sort of privilege, you see. You've practically got a bulletproof vest on in terms of any libel claims, haven't you?
Well, I mean, there are very good reasons for having privilege on the floor of the House of Commons,
Sure.
Which shouldn't be abused. But yeah, that's. I think it's a fair comment.
Talking of them not doing things, the government not doing things they've promised, hot off the press was the news on HS2, which now appears to be stopping in the East Midlands rather than working its way up to Leeds. This, for anybody who doesn't know, was sort of touted as a major development in cross-country travel through this new train link. How did you feel when you learned that the North and obviously the Northwest was going to miss out?
Not surprised, but very annoyed. I mean, to do the extra east-west connection and the extra eastern leg of HS2 would cost an extra 14 billion. This is a government that spent 37 billion on what I call Serco test and trace, and something that is so low value for money that the National Audit Office said that it treated the British taxpayer like a cash point machine. Now, the National Audit Office doesn't normally express itself in those terms. So I think that actually the investment of that extra money would create so many more connections and economic positives for the North that I just do not understand why they've done it. And I think that they will pay a huge price for it.
Well, I queried, why doesn't it stop the other way? Why doesn't it go from Leeds?
There were those of us who wanted them to start constructing it from Leeds down, because I think most of us thought that if they ran out of money halfway through, they'd somehow find the rest of it. And so there were many of us that made that argument that you should start it in the North rather than start it in London, and I wish they had.
But Grant Shapps
But
was
we have said we will do these things if we're elected.
Grant Shapps was on TV today saying all of our trains are still going to be running faster now, though, so it's almost as good as having HS2.
Grant Shapps was on the telly saying Yorkshire's going to get a high-speed line until it was pointed out that it's going to get 2 miles of high-speed line and then it's going to stop.
Just over the Yorkshire border. Yeah. Back to Labour's quest to get back into government. How important do you think it is that the party presents in a very united way to voters at the next election?
I think it's important that the party has simple directions of travel that people can identify with and think are the right solution to some of the problems that we've got as a country. We're in a very pivotal moment for our country at the moment. We've come out of Europe. We're having major battles with our closest trading partners. Our trade with Europe is plummeting and our connections to Europe are being cut off. And that's a real problem. The Prime Minister goes on about global Britain, but actually he's made us Little England. And so I think we've got to remake our place in the world at the same time as we've got to retool our entire economy to deal with climate change and all of the things we have to do to green our economy. And you can only do this with the kind of values that the Labour Party has, which is intervening in the market, using the market, but intervening, making certain that government leads in terms of remaking skills, knowledge, opportunities, investing in the right places, not just leaving it to market mechanisms that simply won't deliver. And so I think we're at a really crucial moment, and I want to see Keir talking about this much more, and I think he will. And I hope and believe that people will realise you have to have a serious person in charge of the country, not a clown.
Well, quite. Just in terms of that sharing of values, this was sort of where I was going on the importance of unity question. When I heard Angela Rayner refer to the government, which with the expression which, to be fair to her, she's since apologised for, and credit to her for that.
Yeah.
And then Keir and other shadow ministers not back her. I thought, are they sharing the same values, or is there in fact a split here? Do you think that the plain talking which Angela expressed?
Well, it's one way of putting it. I mean, I just think the coarsening of public life like that, I think she's right and brave to apologise. It's easy to get a bit carried away.
Yeah, that's true.
At conference, especially when you're touring around all the regional groups and everybody's on your side, and it's easy to sort of let something slip that perhaps you shouldn't. And the real anger that I feel when I see people without food or people on the street, and I know that this government are doing nothing about it, I understand that visceral anger. But I think in a democracy, you've got to use that in a positive way. And so coarsening the language of politics, I don't think helps. I think you've got to be persuasive. So I think that the way to win is to talk about the future, not constantly look at your own belly button or talk about what's happened in the past. Voters aren't interested in what happened in the past. They're interested in what you're offering them and what you can do to help society move on, to help make the country more successful, to help give them a fillip in their own lives or more opportunities, or their kids or their grandkids more opportunities. And I think that's where we are at the moment. We're in a circumstance where our economy increasingly is not working for more and more people. And the only way you can change that is by having Labour values that take account of what people need, the basics that people need in their lives: decent job, decent prospects, enough money to live on, a house, those kinds of necessities that increasingly aren't available for younger generations.
So let's talk about the future then, because obviously we're here and we've talked about the relatively short period to the next election. Are you happy as you are in terms of representing your constituents from the backbenches? I mean, you did, as you mentioned briefly earlier, mount a leadership challenge before Keir Starmer became leader, it has to be said. Was that born of an ambition to lead the party?
I thought that the party was going to suffer at the election and we needed to do something after the Brexit vote, because I thought there was going to be a general election. I put myself forward, and I think I would have done a good job, but I don't think that that's what the party wanted. I'm happy to serve in any context, and I said to Keir that I was happy to serve on the front bench. We'll see what happens. I'm just there. I've got a lot of things that I can do. I've got a lot of experience. I've gone back on the National Executive Committee of the party, which is one of the engine rooms, really. And so very proud to chair conference again for part of its proceedings this year. I just want the Labour Party to be able to be in government so that we can remake society for the better and clear up some of the mess that we see around us today.
And as well as being a member of Parliament, you're also an author. I mentioned to you off camera that I'm really enjoying your book, which is called The New Serfdom. That was written, was about 3 years ago, 4 years ago?
Yeah.
Do you want to just sort of summarise what the book is about? And then I'd love to just ask you a couple of questions about observations I've got having read it.
Well, it's talking about the road to serfdom, which is the Frederick Hayek book that Mrs. Thatcher loved so much and used really as her ideology when she took control of the country in the 1980s. And that is basically saying that the state is almost always bad. Trade unions are evil. You have to use the market to deliver everything and make every decision. And what we've seen is the result of that philosophy, which is effectively still the default philosophy of a lot of the Conservative Party and many of the countries in the West. And what it's led to is huge increases in inequality, the lack of accessibility to necessities like housing in the UK, an impoverished public realm, the fact that the market has a load of what are called externalities, pollution being one of them, which is why we're doing so badly with a lot of our biodiversity and we're ruining the planet. And so the issue is basically what philosophy should there be to start challenging all of this? And I point out in the book that, in fact, even the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is now saying you should have socially balanced growth, that economics and the market aren't the only things that matter, that there are other things about sustainability, social sustainability, environmental sustainability, which he never took account of.
Well, he didn't. And I mean, what interested me in that very good point you just made about the importance of socially driven growth or socially ethical growth was that the way the market has developed, I think, has driven businesses away from that mindset insofar as, to use one example, for a technology company to interact with a business in China is from a pure commercial perspective, financially, quite often in the best interests of the company. And as a CEO myself, whilst I see the social and ethical problem in that mentality, because not only is it depriving the UK of, for example, jobs or of sales, but there are questionable practices around work in China. I still sympathise with CEOs who are driven to make those decisions in the best interest of their businesses, particularly when, of course, we're having to pay more in tax. Do you see a devil's advocate argument there?
Well, there are always devil's advocate arguments, but I would say look at what this philosophy has delivered for our society. We have the most unequal society we've had since probably the late 19th century. We've seen the immiseration of large numbers of people, and we see that in the rise of food banks. We've seen the inefficiency of the use of resources in terms of countries with that kind of competition, and I think that we should be aspiring for more. Bang for the buck, and not we know that the market doesn't always deliver everything, and we know that with climate change we've got to have guided transformation, which won't just happen of its own accord.
Yeah.
And we've seen increasingly, I think, with the deregulation of the labour market and the attacks on trade unions that Mrs. Thatcher was the most interested in, and Hayek praised her for. We've seen the inexorable rise of low pay and in-work poverty, which is leading to the stunted growth of millions and millions of our children, the lack of opportunities, just the nastier side of society coming out, the more selfish side. And I just think that that's not the kind of philosophy that leads to the best solutions.
But it doesn't lead to us all living our best lives, that's for sure.
And also, I think, there's this view that Hayek had and his acolytes have, that rich people need to be paid more to give them more incentives, but poor people need to be made poorer to make them work harder. And when riches get to a certain level, they become completely inefficient because rich people can't spend all their money. So if you look now at the Bloomberg Billionaires Index, they have to change it every day because there's so much. The billionaires are making so much more money every day. They have to update it. And that's not an efficient use of resource because they can't spend all their money. No. They're going into space. They're doing all these things that we know about. But actually, vast majority of that money isn't used productively in an economic sense. And if you look at what Thomas Piketty, the French economist, has said, he said that if levels of growth in an economy are under the rates you can get for capital if you accumulate capital, then what happens is what he calls the explosive growth of capital, which means that rich people just get richer and richer and richer.
Yes.
And fewer and fewer people get access to anything. That is not a socially sustainable world. It's not an economically viable world, and it's not a world I want to live in.
No, and I think there's cause for optimism here, because through a range of reasons, I truly think that in the West, we are heading to what I've been describing as the age of the employee. And the reason for that is that as a business owner, I can honestly say that our biggest challenge at this minute in time is recruitment. And in fact, we'll all see that when we're walking past Costa and Wetherspoons and supermarkets and all of these places, everywhere is recruiting. And the reason for that, I think, is that during COVID, the global job market has become more prevalent, and the existence of more variety in jobs, remote working, more flexible working, has all come to the fore. Throw Brexit into the mix, and there are less people to fill our jobs. When I see things like, I think it's Aldi are increasing their minimum salary to £10.50 an hour or something like that, I think that there's good cause to think that the value of employees, of workers, of team members will increase in the future. And I just wonder if this government have got a sniff of a chance of persuading the electorate that that's due to their astute policies rather than just a lucky coincidence.
Well, then they've also got massive propaganda capacity, Cambridge Analytica style. They can purchase the best with all of the money that they've got their donors to receive during COVID. So don't underestimate the huge disadvantage that any other political party is at with these people. But I just think that having socially and environmentally sustainable businesses is going to be the only choice pretty soon. Yeah. And I think that, for example, the approach that women can bring to being business leaders is also very important because it's more holistic. I think we need a much more holistic system than a system dominated by this view that somehow economic policy in the market is out with the entire system and ought to run it rather than part of the system. Yeah. It's called donut economics if you're interested in having some economic theories that are more holistic and more human focused rather than the thing that Hyatt gave us. And I think that development economics and the way that talks about skills training and environmental sustainability has got much more insights to offer us as a way forward than some of the old 19th century classical economics has. And I think that is the way forward, and I'm optimistic about it.
Now, Paul is going to clobber me in a minute if I don't let you go. Just wanted to finish. I really has been a pleasure meeting you, Angela, and I was so happy when you agreed to come on because I knew we'd have this sort of very rational but also interesting conversation where we've agreed on the vast majority of things, but we've had some interesting back and forths on some. I just want to get your view on something before you depart. I really hope that the next election is the election of the podcast. What I mean by that is that I think the mainstream media and social media is depriving voters, is depriving people of hearing more of a deep dive into the issues that is important. Because even if you look at something like Andrew Marr on a Sunday, who gets a little bit longer with his guests than, say, the Daily News, it's still no more than an exchange of sound bites the vast majority of the time, because there just isn't the time. Whereas today, we've had a really deep dive, we've covered some very important issues, and I hope that in the future, these longer form discussions become the forum whereby the voters can learn more, not just about the policies of the people who want to lead them, but about the people behind the policies. Do you see a case for that?
Well, it'd be nice. Obviously, people blame politicians for using sound bites, but then if you're going to communicate and you have 5 seconds, you don't...
Exactly, it's just impractical to do anything else.
Not a lot you can do. I mean, even on the longer form, things like question time or any questions, you only have a few minutes to make your point. So it would be nice if everyone had the chance to and were willing to listen to longer kind of podcasts. It would certainly be something that suited me. having been on Andrew Marr and all of the other programmes and tried to get points across, you do your best in the time that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've certainly done your very best over the 30 years you've been a member of Parliament. So congratulations to you for that, Angela. I hope that Keir does find a moment to give you some form of cake or something. And Keir, if you haven't got a policy on this yet, you're missing a trick. You've been in leadership for nearly 2 years. Joking apart, congratulations on your 30-year anniversary in Parliament. Well done for serving your constituents in that time and to contributing to political life. And above all, thank you for coming on our podcast. I've really enjoyed meeting you.
Pleasure, I've enjoyed it, and but not as much as I enjoy serving my constituents, and I intend to carry on doing it as long as I can.
What a wonderful way to end. Angela Eagle, thank you very much.
Thank you.